Okay, well, welcome everybody this evening. My name's Jonathan. I'm a writer and a curator based in Norwich. I programme something called Of and By, which is a series of talks, screenings, conversations that are actually usually held at the Assembly House up the road in Norwich. But tonight we're on a sojourn and we're at the Bookhive. The programme Of and By, it doesn't really have a kind of like a thematic design, so it's not really a tightly programmed thing that develops a set of themes or concerns, but really what is the programme, however loosely, is a kind of link to East Anglia, and often the people that are invited to talk have a kind of relationship to overlooked or potentially radical histories. At the last Of and By, only last week, we were joined by the brilliant Norwich-based writer Philippa Snow. We're also joined by Philippa Snow this evening. Snow's debut book, which, as you know, means violence on self-injury as art and entertainment, was published by Repeater this month. It's published by Repeater this month, and it's available to purchase at the Bookhive. Before this last event, we were joined by Rachel Cusk, who read from and discussed the novel Second Place. Previous guests have included poet and translator A.K. Blakemore, the writer Bob Gluck, based in San Francisco, the music writer Matt Annis, who wrote a really fantastic book on British bass music. We've also been joined by the Cine Women Collective, who organised the Norwich Women's Film Weekend from 79 to 89. You can watch these and more on YouTube. You can access an archive and review this material. And I should also just plug a future event as well in a couple of weeks in association with the Bookhive. We'll be hosting the art historian TJ Clark, who has a new book out on Cézanne. And that will be happening at Josie Gallery, which is down the road. If you're interested to learn more about that, you can speak to Henry on but tonight we're joined by the writer, academic and cook, Rebecca May Johnson. Rebecca's debut book, this is not the...
Jonathan's is mildewed.
Debut book, Small Fires, An Epic in the Kitchen, was published by Pushkin Press last month.
Yeah, the 25th of August.
The 25th of August, okay. And Rebecca joins us amid a kind of publicity tour for the new book, and just earlier today was interviewed by Ian McMillan for The Verb Radio 3. Do you know when that will go out?
Next Friday.
Next Friday.
He was very nice, he's good at his job, yeah.
Small Fires is really a singular book. It's sort of part journal, memoir, academic autobiography, cookbook that documents cooking a recipe for 10 or more years in 10 or more kitchens. The contents of the book, Rebecca writes, might have vanished unrecorded, cooked and eaten and washed up, leaving no trace, if they weren't recorded in the book. So, and Rebecca goes on to write, documenting what I do in the kitchen can feel like the task of recording nothing, but it's the nothing that has been part of almost every social interaction of my life as an adult, and through which I've come to know almost all the people that I love. So while undertaking a PhD, and we'll talk about this maybe shortly, on a rewriting of the Odyssey by the German poet and translator Barbara Köhler, Rebecca begins to reflect on how she's been taught that the work of critical thinking takes place outside of the kitchen, and that cooking in a domestic space is not connected to the endeavours of serious thought, as you write. Small Fires, as I understand it, might be the various kitchen hobs on which Rebecca has cooked over the decade, unless they're electric, of course, or induction. The fire is at once elemental and physical. It's a source of energy, transforms ingredients into food and satiates bodies. Might be the heat of chili, the heat of bodily desire and appetite. And as Rebecca writes, I tried to write a book about cooking, but I wrote a hot red epic. The study of the Odyssey parallels the epic of cooking, which, as you write, also gathers life, words, things and people together again and again and again. At the beginning of the book, you write this really memorable line: to write the book, it's necessary to blow up the kitchen and rebuild it to cook again, critically alert, seeking pleasure and revelation. The new kitchen hosts many others who have come before, and one of the wonderful things about the book is this kind of depth of connection across history and place that so there's a sense in which many different people, friends, but also people who are absent, presences, are with you in the kitchen. For me, and apparently for others as well, one of the most brilliant and hilarious parts of the book is Rebecca's brilliant kind of experimental skewering of the psychoanalyst D.W. Winnicott's sausage. It's a really brilliant travestying of a kind of patriarchal theoretical knowledge production, and you write, who are the people sitting at Winnicott's table with no appetites and emotions? In Winnicott's theory, I cannot find evidence of the cook, the recipe, the sausages, or those who eat, only his unscorched hands, clean shirt, and method for knowledge production about what it means to cook has been engineered outside of the kitchen. It's also an epic story of love, I think, that plots in this really, really deftly, compelling way the kind of journey between cooking for ourselves and others, and also a kind of politics of collectivity that can nurture and feed us. So, towards the end of the book, there is this kind of movement away from you into, I mean, you're aware, you're attuned to it throughout the book, but there is this kind of very kind of deft thing that you do at the end that hopefully we can talk about a bit more. So we've got a selection of readings. We'll have a conversation, and then of course we'll open up to the floor. I'm sure you'll all have lots of questions that you want to ask, and we'll go for about an hour maybe, or even less.
Yeah. Who knows? See how we feel, but also won't keep people captive. Thanks for that very generous and thoughtful introduction, Jonathan, and thanks everyone for coming, and the Bookhive as well for having me. It's really nice to be here. So I'll just do some reading. I don't assume that everyone's read the book. It's only just come out, and it's nice to do some reading. Give Jonathan a break. So I'm going to read a bit from the chapter Hot Red Epic, which I write about cooking the same recipe 1,000 times over a 10-year period, which I sort of position as a sort of parallel endeavour to the Odyssey in a slightly grandiose gesture. Whatever, you can do what you like in your own book. Okay. I have never met the person who wrote the recipe, but it is recommended to me on a newspaper website by a cook who has been recommended to me by another cook whose judgment I trust because I have tasted her food. The route to the recipe is made by tongues. It is by far the cheapest and easiest recipe in a feature about famous chefs' favourite recipes, but it is precise in ways I do not expect. During my first performance of the recipe, I have a revelation about ingredients, or vegetables. They are things. I must learn to watch them closely, ready to accommodate their whims, which are not human. The recipe is a method for responding to things. Things have agency in many directions. Like words, they have histories and contexts. But when I perform the recipe, things become other things in a messier transformation than words in a sentence. They spatter my shirt red. The recipe is a text that can produce spattering because it was spattering before it was language. Language is only a holding pattern for the recipe, not its origin, nor its terminus. Spattering is not mentioned in the recipe. The text does not anticipate the liveliness of the process it describes, which spatters wildly. The substance of the pan trespasses beyond its linguistic boundary, making marks or mark-making on my shirt, the wall, the dry surface of whatever book is close by. There is always more. There is more than has been recorded in the text, and there will be more again. Things will be hotter and redder. There will be spattering and crying. In some ways, the recipe gives me no clue about what is to come. This is hard to forgive. But after cooking it 1,000 times, the recipe turns out to be good enough. It holds me and survives my many attempts to destroy it. I'll keep reading. The second, third and fourth time I make the recipe, I follow the instructions as precisely as I can. reverent and still wonderstruck by the transformation of matter in which I am a participant. My body is changed by the recipe. After tasting it, I see flavour differently, which means I see things differently, because flavour is a quality of things, or can be. And it's not seeing, it's tasting, but it's a tasting that inaugurates a different relationship to things, a new method of perceiving. It is not only the surface I am looking at, I am learning to see into things, seeking the dimension of being that is flavour. There are so many possibilities. Each time I encounter the same thing, the same ingredient, I find that it's different again, different again, so the recipe is always a method for seeking. When I think about performing the recipe, I think about the movements of subatomic particles or the orbits of moons and planets. There is a physics to it. The recipe introduces me to principles of touch, knife work, heat and time, the temporality of white becoming gold in oil. I must be careful about how I move my hands. The interventions they make can be significant. They are always in relation. In the study of electrons, nothing is ignored because everything can have an effect, even looking. The proverb of a watched pot never boils was taken up by physicists trying to find ways to describe the behaviour of quantum particles. Watched pot behaviour is another term for the Zeno effect in quantum physics, whereby frequent measurement inhibits the process being observed from actually taking place. Sometimes my anxiety or impatience causes me to take the pan off the heat too soon. Cooking often hovers at the fringes of serious thought. I see it used as a metaphor in philosophical texts, invoked in introductory paragraphs, deployed to convey the complexity of processes that are not cooking. But I find I need to draw on all available resources to articulate the complexity of the recipe. After 10 years or more of experimentation, I have not exhausted its possibilities. I have not found a limit for what the recipe can teach me about being in the world. The recipe is a method of navigation, a method for seeing or seeking what is beyond me. The recipe makes a space in my life where time does not pass, but accumulates as a hot red sea full of feeling, good and bad. Just read it about Berlin now. Yeah. The month before I moved to Berlin to study and work, I perform the recipe and my hair is even shorter and red with a blue and blonde fringe. Blue quickly fades to grey. For the first performance of the recipe in Berlin, my hair is white blonde and I've painted the top half of my face pink. I am drunk and I play Giorgio Moroder, whose music I have recently started listening to. I put my favourite apron over my clothes. It is checked green and orange and is made from pliable cotton, and I pull it tight. In this apron I orchestrate many large meals. For the third performance of the recipe in Berlin, my hair is still white blonde. I am wearing blue lipstick with dark blue glitter over the top, affixed with lip gloss, and dramatic black eyebrows painted much higher than my own on my forehead. Black eyeliner, a drawn-on beauty spot, and a blue leotard. The more artificial I look, the better it feels, being not essentially anything. At 3 a.m. I go to the club, Bookhive, with my friends, and we queue in the snow and then dance to pounding techno until 11 a.m, which counts as an early bedtime for many attendees. When I'm not in nightclubs or cooking in the apartment, I wander the city alone, wearing large headphones. The headphones make a space for me that is insulated from social interactions. Most nights when I'm not out, I wake up at 4 or 5 a.m. in a panicked alcohol sweat and call the very patient person I'm seeing long distance in the UK. Apart from my Norwegian flatmate, with whom I spend most of my time, a philosophy graduate I recognise in a nightclub from a London library, the owner of the fashion store I work in, and a customer whom I befriend. The only people I speak to are those with few enough boundaries to make it past my headphones. The 200th time I make the recipe is a kind of madness. Cooking becomes a social support I lean on too heavily. A German teenager in my literature class at the university manages to strike up a conversation, declaring her admiration for my tight red jeans. Unprepared and taken aback, I give a freakish and exaggerated performance of social courtesy and promise to cook a meal for all her friends for her birthday at my apartment without asking my flatmates. She is local and lives with her parents and treats the occasion as a chance to go wild. I feel hysterical as I serve food to dozens of people I have never met, who flood the apartment, play music I don't like, and intrude on my flatmate's private space. I find out that I do not like the girl whose birthday party I am hosting, that I do not know her at all. We do not really speak again after that night. Even worse, I make a fatal substitution in the recipe, not anticipating how differently the ingredient would behave. The thought of all these strangers eating the manic, bad dish haunts me painfully. And then I'll just read a few aphorisms. Okay, got some aphorisms about recipes. After a bit, which I'll spare you from when I write about Adorno and Horkheimer, the German philosophers, but not right now. Well, yeah, actually no. I cannot know the recipe text until I cook it. No, actually. The recipe shows me time as material change. The recipe establishes a correspondence between material change and language, between time and language. The recipe means that time is no longer divisible like empty abstract space. The recipe is always gathering life into itself, gathering words and things and people together again and again. Rolled up sleeves. How will life continue? Like this, here and there, and then and now. The recipe only returns at the request of the body. The recipe serves at the pleasure of the body. I think I'll end there. And that is a very very too well disguised reference to The West Wing, which I was watching when I was writing that bit, because there's a line where they always say, "I serve at the pleasure of the president," anyway, and it just was in my mind. And anyway, yeah, sorry.
Fantastic, thank you. You touch on a number of kind of important ideas that kind of run throughout the book and actually kind of there at the beginning. I mean, at the outset, you talk about, you offer up a kind of recipe right at the outset to begin an epic, and you summon a body, and you put your apron on, and then you immediately go about kind of gender fucking this image of yourself in the apron. Yeah. You know, you take this wonderful image of you posing in the mirror with one foot on the IKEA table in the living room, and you summon big dick energy. You write, "What I'm doing in this apron is not what you think I'm doing in this apron." And so my first question is, what are you doing in this apron?
I mean, what aren't I doing in the apron, I guess? Yeah, I guess, you know, the reason I found it important to address the body and the gendered body at the beginning of the book is the kitchen is such a sort of heavily gendered space in sort of popular iconography and history of labour, and also so beset by cliche. And the apron is a very cliched garment in many ways, you know, sort of so endless phrases around apron strings and stuff like that. And so I guess, you know, I was positioning myself at the beginning of this epic as somebody with a body sort of attempting to sort of challenge and deconstruct some essentialized ideas about gender and things that I'd found personally oppressive. And I guess my kind of cooking of this recipe unfolding over 10 years is in parallel with me also undoing many of those norms that I'd found difficult, and also why for a long time I found it difficult to write about cooking per se, because I felt like it was quite difficult to find a space in writing about food that made sense for me, beyond the simple documentation of recipes. So I really wanted to play with the apron strings. I'll see if I can find a few lines that are and to sort of as Jonathan says, I cook something and I literally I've still got the selfie. I'm wearing a sort of a unisex suit by actually a Norfolk, the East Anglian connection, a Norfolk label called Old Town.
Oh yeah.
Popular with many people in Norfolk and beyond. They have a genderless thing called a Unity suit. Right. Anyway, which I was wearing, and which is very baggy, and I tied an apron very tight over it, and I put my foot on the table and took a photo of myself, and I felt like I had some really big dick energy when I took that picture, and I write that in the book. But for me, that sort of the sort of playing between the tightness of apron strings and sort of the engagement of apron strings with the body and the state of embodiment, which is so important to cooking, and then the sort of, I guess, the desire to feel more kind of mask or baggy in my outfit was something was a tension that I wanted to have there, just also to feel comfortable in the book, I suppose, as a sort of subject in some way. So yeah, it felt important for me to do that. Let me just see if I can find a line that might be useful. Well, I have this question. I have a sort of provocation quite early in the book in the chapter section called Apron Strings, which I just say, do you have positive feelings about aprons? Yes and no. Strings. And, I feel like many people might ask themselves that question, do you have positive feelings about aprons? Or, like, what are your feelings about the apron as a garment and, what it entails? And then I say, like, the erotics of tying my apron strings tightly. And I talk about how I like to wear my apron strings in a slightly bondage sort of passage. Because I wanted the kitchen to also be habilitated as a sort of an erotic space. It's a space of great intimacy and to do with pleasure. And I think the sort of domesticating discourse around cooking sort of can often take away from the sort of real eroticism of the kitchen, and the sort of way it actually moves beyond hierarchies of certain heteronormative relationships, in the sense that we're often just in hierarchies of relationships, and that we're often giving people things to put in their body and give them pleasure and who knows who they might be or what our relation, I wanted to sort of, I feel like I'm just gone on to a whole different stream of talking now, but I wanted that to bring that to the fore and have it outside of the kind of narrative of social reproduction of the family unit, or to also liberate it for people who cook, even if for many people maybe their daily cooking is bound to looking after children or other sorts of things. That didn't want it to. I wanted it to also to reveal other sides of it.
Because it comes and so you sort of it's the gambit, the opening gambit, right? You're challenging a kind of essentialized idea of a body, and this is then followed by your prologue of the introduction of these three figures. Two of them you might expect to see side by side, Martha Rosler and Sylvia Federici, but then Nigella Lawson is brought into the mix as well, and you like after having blown up the kitchen, it's like you kind of then think with these three figures to develop a materialist analysis, a materialist feminist analysis of the conditions of the domestic and work. And then Nigella teaches you something about pleasure. But I wonder if you could talk about some of those figures. Nigella's obviously very
I'll explain who they are as well, because I don't expect everyone knows who everyone is in advance of reading it. Martha Rosler she's still alive, but she had a sort of seminal moment in the 70s as a feminist performance artist, among other things. But she's made various different works about food in the kitchen. And in 26, so I didn't go to art school, so I don't have a sort of detailed art education, but anyway, in 2016 I told a friend who's an artist that I was writing about the kitchen, and she sent me a link to Martha Rosler's video, which you can find on YouTube. It's a couple of minutes long, called Semiotics of the Kitchen, and it's an amazing performance in which she goes through the alphabet from A to Z. I think she goes from A to Z. Yeah, she does go from A to Z. And she kind of holds a kitchen implement and she kind of does stuff. She's like, what with it? It's like almost like a send up of performatively joyful domestic TV chefs of the period and of the 50s and the 60s, because her performance is entirely devoid of joy. So all you're seeing is the labour in effect, and the body of the woman being sort of almost operated by the machinery. You know, the agency almost seems to be with the kitchen machinery rather than her. But this A to Z begins with an apron and she puts it on. So I find that a useful tool. And it's sort of the academic and theorist Sara Ahmed writes about happiness as being sort of part of the part of the work that hides the work, often in domestic space, and so Rosler sort of sucks out the sort of performance of love as part of the work, which then connects. So Silvia Federici, at the same year as Martha Rosler made this video, published a pamphlet that's part of a movement called Wages for Housework, and in that there's a great phrase. They say it's love, about domestic work as a sort of emanation of love, which then, you know, there's a really, the tricky knotting of those things together is that if you withdraw your domestic labour, you're withdrawing love. So it's a real emotional blackmail that she sort of identifies there that makes it, so then you also can't go on strike, or you can't withdraw it and then come back to it on your own terms, because it's part of this sort of gendered performance of love, which is so tricky. So I write about those things, and I found that useful. I mean, these texts have been around for ages. Federici's been around for ages, but each generation has to discover things at their own time and their own pace, and I found that really interesting, and it sort of helped me unpick certain things about my, even outside the family, just my need to sort of perform certain labours for people I lived with in a way that felt very emotionally intense or tiring, even when I didn't really want to do them. I was like, why am I doing this? I don't even know. So there's Martha Rosler and Federici, which were a really helpful kind of unromanticising of the kitchen. I also wanted to unromanticise the kitchen, to almost have a clean slate, to then begin writing about what was going on, trying to kind of deconstruct some of the cliches, which I just found made it difficult for me to think clearly. But then I write about, I use the metaphor from the Odyssey being between a rock and a hard place, but you have to pass through. So, you know, there's that on the one side hand, so whatever. And then on the other, I guess I found Nigella, who's a figure I also found quite challenging. As a teenager, I found her overt femininity, performance of femininity. Sure, it's camp. She knew it was camp, but as a 15-year-old, what the hell did I, you know, in deep rural Suffolk, what did I know about camp, you know? Nothing, really. I mean, also the sort of late 90s, early noughties, mid-noughties was a sort of weird cultural moment.
Because you really, I mean, we established earlier that we were exactly the same age, but you really evoked that period of new labour, and you talk about the kind of refashioning of ideas of like entrepreneurialism, aspirationalism, of the idea of like bringing women out of the kitchen.
Get out the kitchen, girls. It'll be fine. You know, just leave the kitchen and get an office job, and suddenly there'll be no poverty, and it'll be fine, and there'll be no problems in the world anymore. It was really that I really felt we received that message quite strongly, and the only also we did the high school curriculum. Some of my classmates are here tonight, and we mainly studied texts in which domestic labour was framed as a sort of hell, specifically for white women, white bourgeois women. We did The Handmaid's Tale, and we did various other texts I can't really remember now. Anyway, I was afraid of Nigella and her pink fluffy cardigan and her claim to pleasure. And my mum didn't have her books, and I was slightly suspicious of her as well. And then but I was also sort of secretly fascinated and obsessed, as many people are. You know, you can't look away. And so I've been thinking about it over and over again for years. And then I also realised I had a lot of uninterrogated misogyny about her overt and confident claim to authorship of recipes and authorship of her own cooking, of her own actions, which so often people who are great cooks often many women I've encountered almost disown their own amazing creations. Oh, you know, it was nothing, or oh, you know, it was just this or just that or whatever. So there's that sort of the fact she said, oh, it's my, and then I was like so arrogant saying it's my this. I'm like, well, it's like, yeah, actually she did make it. She's not just some kind of natural resource that, you know.
But you perceive that as being kind of proprietorial.
But actually there's exactly, and you know, we won't talk about, well, maybe we will talk about capitalism now, and there's an element in which that operates within capitalism. Obviously it sells books for her, but there's also, there is a subtle radicalism in her claiming of that domestic thinking and work and authorship. Also, her total unabashed claim to pleasure as the baseline expectation of life, not a sort of austerity politics of just getting by or just, you know, eating enough or whatever, but that pleasure should be embedded in the everyday and is a political aspiration, is an aspiration for life, which has a sort of radical quality to it, because actually that's often not, there's a sort of weird pleasure in self-denial in British politics often, I don't know, is often reverting back to sort of like discourses of rationing and stuff like that, rather than dreaming of a politics of abundance, which I think, you know, you could arguably say is part of what is happening in Nigella's kitchen, dreaming of abundance and of joy in life. And so once the kitchen had been dismantled in certain ways, I found it important to also think in a sort of, I guess, dismantling is a sort of backwards looking activity in a sense, but then I wanted to also be forward looking and thinking about the, you know, pleasure and the body and abundance and that kind of thing. And I found re-watching her as having gone through some of these thoughts, and I watched the TV show of Cook, Eat, Repeat, and I have the book as well. There's an amazing scene where she serves herself pudding, which I write about in the book. I could read it, it's not very long actually. And I just wrote down in my journal, you know, after watching it, and then and then I just transcribed that into the book. So it's just, if I can find it, where is it? Here we go. Yeah, and also she's not into the whole like guilty pleasure thing or cheat day or whatever, that kind of, I don't know if anyone knows what that means, it's a very depressing concept anyway. Don't look it up. When I watch Nigella on TV now, I see her differently than I did at high school. A journal entry from the 1st of December 2020 documents my attempt to describe all that is going on as Nigella serves herself a dish from her book Cook, Eat, Repeat. And this is a journal entry. Watching Nigella last night as she serves herself lemon and elderflower pudding, it occurs to me that she gives the viewer permission to have a body. After describing the pudding she has taken out of the oven, crisp and golden, springy, squidgy, and drizzling it lavishly with elderflower cordial and lemon juice, she says, quote, "I'm going to give myself a bit of the corner," as she looks down at it. Then there's a pause as she looks back at the viewer, fully facing the camera, and says, quote, "A bit of everything, actually." Then she scoops 3 large, wobbling spoons of pudding into her bowl. Not only 1 more spoon than the corner, but 2. The repetition of serving herself more, not once, but twice, makes it a helping that is 3 times the size of the corner she begins with. The 3 servings give the performance the quality of a ritual, of a spell. Each spoon of pudding strengthens the spell. It is as if Nigella banishes the cursed apparition of a disapproving look. With each spoon she rids herself of a layer of inhibition and comes closer to expressing her true appetite, her true power. Then, as if to seal the effect of her spell, Nigella pours enough double cream over the pudding to half fill the bowl, takes it away and eats it, alone. I'm reminded of Susan Sontag's "Be bold, be bold, be bold," said not once but 3 times in an address to young women graduates. 3 times to make it stick. The bad thing is not going to happen if you give yourself 3 helpings of pudding, if you let yourself exist. That's what I wrote on Nigella. But And I feel like the corner, you know, like women allowing themselves a corner of pudding, I don't know, it's just so depressing, and it's sort of so self-denying, and I just really love the fact she keeps advancing into the pudding. And, you know, I don't know.
The Federici is really interesting in terms, like, to frame women's work as, like, Federici has to frame women's work in terms of labour in order for it to be seen as having value, in order to materialise its value.
Yeah.
And in the introduction, I mean, you discuss the way in which, you know, this stuff will just disappear if you don't write it down, if you don't document it, if you don't see the value in it. And so I wonder, you know, this has taken place alongside your PhD, and I wonder at what point you realised that this was something that could be developed into a book that had value and was something that was worthwhile as a writing.
It took me ages, mostly to get the confidence to even have an idea. You know, if you're sort of feeling really anxious and not allowing the thought to even happen because you're almost denying it's even happened at all, like I sort of say in the introduction, it's very hard to have an idea if you don't give yourself the chance. I don't know. And I kept sort of saying, I don't have any idea, you know, I don't have anything to say, I have no ideas. So there was lots of different moments, really. My agent, so I published a few different bits of writing about food on the internet, and I started a blog in 2011, which is quite a late point in time to start a blog in the history of the internet, but anyway. And I just really it's called Dinner Document, and I just documented what I'd cooked for people I'd lived with, and what, you know, and the person I was seeing at the time made fun of it, like it was a bit like echoing my own feelings about Nigella, like,
right,
you've got nothing, like, why would you write down a recipe? It's just your recipe for poached eggs and tomatoes, like, what's that? That's so boring, like, why would you do that? Which is really nice. Thankfully I got some therapy free for my PhD and ended that very bad relationship. Anyway, writing recipes seemed a sufficiently safe way to begin writing that wasn't even visible as writing, because it's, you know, it's this like not almost non-speech of gendered labour. I was just documenting what I was doing. There's no agency here, I'm just documenting something that's happened.
Was it an exercise to get you to just write? I mean, was it
partly? I just realised, well, I was very depressed doing my PhD. I was, you know, struggling to get out of bed, just didn't know what the hell was going on, was sort of having panic attacks even at the thought of writing a single word. I was mortally terrified of one of my PhD supervisors, who actually, someone else who had her used to come out in hives before supervisions, because they made her she made them so anxious. So I'm not alone. She once told me that she would vomit if I changed my thesis plan. Anyway, such is life in PhD world. But you know, they offer free therapy, so as a sort of kind of an opposite reaction to that. Anyway, I think I just felt like the only thing of value I was doing was cooking. I couldn't write my PhD. I was really, really struggling in many, many ways. But you know, once you make a space for yourself, for me it was this recipe blog, things can happen in that space. And if the space isn't there, nothing happens in the space. And actually, once you make a space, you don't know what's going to happen in that space. It could be anything. And through time, because I made a space for that voice, which was initially just basically documenting what I'd cooked for my housemates or whoever, I started playing around. It was my playroom. That's terrible. Very interested in play, anyway, which I write about in the book. And I slowly started doing other kinds of writing as well, and playing and writing essays, and kind of it grew. And on the basis of that, I got approached by an agent. I don't know what she read. She found me on Twitter. I don't know. And then she talked about writing a book, but that was 2016, and it took me years to actually get confident enough to actually decide on something. And she sent me the Susan Sontag thing with the Be Bold in it to try and like get me to like, you know, get a bit more fucking confidence.
Did you finish the PhD?
I did. I published it as a monograph as well.
Right.
But it took me 6 years, guys. Yeah, but yeah, and then actually friends and things help like that. So there's a friend who's actually doing a PhD at UEA, Jen Kaleha, who's a PhD in translation. She's a great writer and translator. She asked me in 2015 to translate a short story by an Austrian writer into a recipe and make an installation.
Right.
Because she had this great job as a cultural curator at the Austrian kind of cultural forum thing, which is a bit like the Goethe Institute, if you know what that is, or the British School of something. Anyway, and so that was cool. And it was the writer's called Anna Weidenholzer, and it was a short story about a caretaker in a secondary school in Austria. But I tried to sort of trace the sort of current of narrative in that and make it into a recipe, which ended up being actually a rice pudding recipe.
Right.
And then I also did a weird, really grotesque fuck up of a spanakopita, which was exploding with frankfurter sausages. And you cut in the pastry, and there was frankfurter sausages sort of spewing out of it. And anyway, but that was really helpful because I did a sort of critical text to accompany the process, and then that was part of this sort of playful critical writing about recipes. So there were lots of different people along the way, like the agent. I'd never thought I'd write a book, and she approached me, and Jen, and so lots of people asking you to do stuff, and it built towards me doing the book.
Because the book is also full of experimentation, and you talk about how you've invited other people to cook rice pudding for you and to interpret the
that was fun.
Rodin recipe, and what's very striking about it is also that you're journaling, and then there's large parts of your journal which is put in there, and there's also like transcriptions of stuff that you're writing down off the back of envelopes, and you try to kind of show where you've crossed stuff out and then rewritten stuff, and so there's a kind of I guess that might be seen as an act of translation, but there's a kind of desire for proximity to this kind of notational thing. Lots of different forms of writing that feed into it. It's really a hybrid book in the best way. I wonder if you knew at the outset that it needed to be like that it needed to be hybrid, and to bring all of these different things together, and what that might achieve or enact in terms of what you were thinking about of the recipe and cooking from the recipe.
I didn't know how the book was going to end when I started writing it,
right.
And I wrote the conclusion on the day I submitted the book.
Right.
I sort of performed something, and I transcribed what I performed, and because I wanted it to be literally the end. I became very preoccupied for the second half of the book with accepting what was happening in the now. The binding the moment of writing to the moment of things happening, and because I wrote the second half of the book by hand and then transcribed it and did some pretty gentle editing. The first half of the book is some sentences I've rewritten over 100 times,
right.
And it's sort of the progressive loosening up of the ego, I suppose, and by the end I'm sort of just lying on the sofa eating frozen pizza. And I managed to rouse myself for one final performance in the conclusion. And but I wanted, I suffer periodically from fatigue, and I'm pretty sure down to my PhD trauma.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah.
And in between chapters I had to often spend a few weeks in bed recovering, actually, from the intensity of writing, and I was unsure how to. I knew I wanted the final section of the book to be about the other and my encounter with the other, and it sort of begins with a Rilke poem about the self-other relationship, but which sort of gets radically pivoted in a Rilke poem, and. So I began in this sort of more, I guess, overtly intentional way, and my process was really helped along by writing a paper for a conference at the Royal College of Art, which was about performance and writing, and I began the process of writing down about the recipe I cooked 1,000 times. And but then I wanted to document inactivity, fatigue, difficulty with even getting up, eating frozen food and takeaways, because I'm not always some like high functioning person cooking loads of meals. I'm often also not doing that, and that's also a really important part of domestic work, is not doing it or being unable to do it for whatever reason. And so
what did framing the recipe as a performance do? What did that allow you to do? How did that change your thinking about the recipe?
I found using different discourses, like discourse from performance art, or artistic discourses, and other things like, let's stick with art because I can't think of anything else right now, helpful in alienating cooking and the recipe from a domestic context to help me think about it more. So I guess I did that in some ways with Marxist politics, Marxist theory, and but also I found the performance really helpful, because the more I began trying to write about the recipe, the more it eluded me in a way of, when is a recipe, where is a recipe. The recipe text is an annotation of something that happened in the past, that it's also a performance text gesturing to a future performance. And I just found the discourse of performance really helpful to think about the embodiedness of it as a form of knowledge, and the relationship between language and the body that the recipe kind of brings into being. And it helped me resolve a problem that really bothered me all the way through my 20s when I was studying, of the relationship between language and embodiment, which I felt like I read Judith Butler's Gender Trouble when I was like 19 or 20, and it was like an incredible, joyful moment of release from essentialized ideas about how you have to be in a body according to gender or whatever. But then I, through thinking about the linguistic the linguistic world in which we live, but then I didn't find a way to reconnect language and the body, and I kept turning to different philosophers like Rosie Braidotti, lots of her great lectures on YouTube if you want to look her up, for example, and different philosophers, and I didn't really find an answer until I started spending time with thinking about the recipe. Because when I started writing this, I realised that each time I cooked this recipe, I was returning the body to language over and over again through time. And I guess for the first time I really got Derrida's thought of the idea of différance, and the sort of the accrual of life into language through performance and through living. And I felt suddenly more joyful about language again in a way that excited me. And I don't know if that's really helped answer the question, but you
also then you kind of this relationship between language and embodiment. You then, you're always referring back to the Odyssey throughout the text.
Yeah, shut up. Some people on Goodreads aren't happy about that. Sorry.
But then this relationship between
everyone's allowed their own reading.
This relationship between language and embodiment becomes a way for you to think about the siren song, and in the Odyssey of Odysseus being tethered to the mast of the ship, and you mentioned Adorno and Horkheimer earlier.
Great bar chat.
Yeah. But you sort of talked about, we were talking about this earlier, how there was a kind of triangulation of like your background in German studies, your interest in classics, and cooking, and I wonder if you could talk about how those things link together in relation to language and embodiment.
Oh my God, that's so big.
Sorry. Well, maybe I could just ask you about the siren song. Why is the siren song important for you?
I found I wrote about the sirens in two different places of the book, one in the recipe chapter and one in the Winnicott chapter. And I was trying to Odysseus and Winnicott both come out badly out of that. But I don't know how many people know the Odyssey. I didn't know it before I had to do a PhD, and have to do a PhD in it. Sorry, I didn't know it before I did a PhD in it. So I'll just describe what happens. That the sirens song supposedly has sort of all the knowledge of all history in it, but it draws, they call to you and they draw you near in a way that might imperil your life. Odysseus figures a way to kind of crack this mythic system by tying himself to the mast. I think actually Circe gives him the idea for this. Many of his best ideas come from Circe. Anyway, he ties himself to the mast so he can pass by them, but he doesn't get his skin in the game. He doesn't let his body come close to the sirens. So he wants to he has a sort of extractive relationship to their knowledge and their song. He wants to sort of take the information out of it without subjecting his body to what the song does as a sort of well, a song is embodied, isn't it? It's not just a text on the page. And Adorno and Horkheimer write about this as breaking the link between language and that to which it refers. So language and the body, or language and the world as its physical thing. And I just say, maybe I should read this out because it took me really ages to figure out how to say this in a clear way in the book. I mean, really, my point is that you can't know the recipe without cooking it. You have to. It's not knowledge that you can have without entering your skin without entering your body into the frame. And I'm kind of saying that Odysseus couldn't really have had that knowledge either to a significant extent because he didn't hazard his body. He didn't allow it to go through what it needed to go through to take on the knowledge contained in their song, because he tried to sever that link. And I'm saying that, and trying to hold the world at arm's length, and it's a foolish endeavour to try and know what a recipe can teach you without cooking it or eating it. Like, what relevance does it have as information without being eaten, or without because it exists purely to serve the body as knowledge. A recipe that doesn't serve the body has no future.
It's a really amazing idea. I was really struck by this. That the perseverance of it, the continuation of it is through the relation to the body. But you put this to work in the now famous sausage chapter. The Winnicott sausage chapter, where you begin the chapter really enamoured by his theory of creativity, but then you go on to find that there is a kind of denigration of women's labour. And a kind of valuing of their labour. And what's so amazing about this chapter, which is so, you're travestying, I think, Winnicott here, but what's so amazing about it is that you start with this set of ideas, and then through cooking, the recipe, returning to the Mrs. Beeton's recipe, you then arrive at a different point and also review what you thought at the outset as well. And so it's a really, I wondered, why did you do that? But also it says something very clearly about this idea of cooking as a form of knowledge production, which works against Winnicott's own, form of knowledge production. I like Winnicott. I mean, for those who don't know him, he's a sort of mid-20th century psychoanalyst. Many, particularly women, were grateful to him for the concept of the good enough mother in the mid-20th century, giving some sort of latitude to people with children, that you don't have to be this sort of perfect model, giving some kind of space beyond that. He's also written really interestingly and brilliantly about play and creativity. And the reason I partly went to cook this sausage recipe was because I realised I'd forgotten how to play halfway through writing the book. And I sort of got tangled up in theory and I needed to go back in the kitchen. So I thought, well, I should do some cooking. I should go and play in the kitchen. And a kind of great moment of... I knew I needed to write this chapter about challenging people trash talking recipes, which happens a lot on Twitter for those who inhabit that dark place. But on Twitter, so also the flip side, somebody who's a psychoanalyst and writer called Hannah Proctor, although maybe that isn't her name because she has two names on the internet. But anyway, tweeted a screenshot of this Winnicott text about recipes, which was in the 70s. He gave a paper to define a model of what it is to live a creative life. And he positions that cooking with a recipe is the antithesis of living creatively. And he writes this binary
I mean, we love to break a binary, between cooking from a recipe which can only be slavish and compliant, and a very colonial misogynist language he's using there, on the one hand. On the other hand is to cook without a recipe and to have an original, authentic encounter with what you're cooking, which in this case, and he chose this, a sausage, as a psychoanalyst. And he wants an unmediated encounter with a sausage.
As people do.
Yeah. And he's concerned that if he uses Mrs. Beeton's recipe, that could interfere with his authentic encounter with a sausage. And you couldn't, in kind of the popular imagination, you couldn't think of a more sort of mother of all recipes figure in British culture than Mrs. Beeton. So this amazing sort of Oedipal triangle appears, instantly. Oedipal he's got this anxiety that his mother's going to touch his sausage or interfere with his encounter with the sausage, and it will stop him from becoming a full subject and expressing himself as he needs to. But whereas in much of his theorising, he's incredibly careful. So in his writing about play and other things, if you read his work, he's often very tentative and careful about not arriving at a conclusion or a theory before the patient, the analysand, to use psychoanalytic language, comes to that point themselves. He tries to not kind of predetermine what's going to happen. With cooking, he feels totally at liberty to develop this kind of hardcore theory about creative life with no case study, with no patience, with no apparent actual experiment. And that just, I was like, oh, I'm so disappointed in you, Winnicott. You've let me down, Winnicott. Anyway, so I decided to make myself his patient, effectively, to make myself the analysand. And I found a Mrs. Beeton recipe for sausages via Google Books, and I made it. And then I just wrote down what happened. I tried to be like Winnicott and sort of transcribe in a sort of very accurate way what happened and what I was feeling. And I had a sort of ecstatic, erotic spring awakening cooking sausages, and it was 80s Day on the radio, and I was dancing, and there was I can't remember, Chaka Khan was on radio, and it was just great. And also, it's very hard to follow a recipe exactly. It's like, I think it helps here maybe to think about the idea of performance text. Like, each time if you're a performance artist or whatever, no performance can ever be the same. There's always so many other factors happening. And it's really a document of the living moment. I was really inspired when I was writing the second half of the book in particular by several pieces of work by the psychoanalyst and poet Noor Al-Sadir, who just recently published a book of non-fiction as well. She cites Roland Barthes talking about loving work that captures the grain of the real. And really, I became obsessed with the grain of the real. And really trying to kind of accurately write down what I was feeling and not exclude stuff. And so I tried to do that with this sausage writing, and I sort of almost ran out of ways to express what I went through when I cooked the sausages, to the extent that I ran out of language and drew a diagram, which my publisher was very sceptical about being able to include in the book, which is lots of triangles. It's about all the relationships I enter into when I cook the sausages. And because cooking a recipe is a really kind of intense intersubjective encounter with so many things, with the text and maybe the author of the text and the person you're cooking for and the ingredients and maybe also yourself and your own mood, and then the kind of the echoes that those things provoke.
Could you read what you wrote down in your account of cooking? Because not the diagram.
No, some of
it. It's quite long, but maybe you could read
a bit of it.
Yeah.
It's just it's quite a simple account of cooking sausages, but I'll read some. But anyway, I transcribed it directly from my journal, so it's just I've got very big, bad handwriting, so it's only about 3 words a line. But I made Mrs. Beeton's recipe for frying sausages for it the first time. I found the recipe on Google Books. It is a 19th century version. I'm not sure which edition. I looked to the sausages to relieve me from a feeling of abstraction that arose from tying myself in knots writing. It is like a mist descends. I felt distant from the world, bodies, things. I went especially to buy the sausages at a nearby butcher. I'm not a particular fan of the butcher. I've had strange experiences there before in the past, but one of their sausages is quite nice. I bought 12 sausages, 6 for today, 6 for another time. At home, I washed the pan I felt would be the best host for the sausages. Mrs. Beeton does not specify apart from a frying pan. I chose a pan not too snug, as I did not want them to semi-steam and not so large they would scorch and lose their moisture. Cast iron. I put the radio on. It is 1980s day on the radio station when I turn it on. Lots to dance to. The soaring, desire, anguish-filled male falsetto voice of the 80s, and rap and pop with samples. I take the sausages out of the bag and separate them with a small knife. They are gorgeously fat, and I can see flecks of pepper and herbs. I try to prick them with a fork, as Mrs. Beeton instructs, but the tines are too blunt to penetrate the casing, so I use the end of a small knife with a black handle from IKEA. I turn the oven on and put in 2 plates to warm. I do not want it all to become cold. I cut a 1-inch by 0.5 centimetre piece of butter, lightly salted, and put it in the pan and watch it melt. I was unsure whether to do this. Mrs. Beeton writes, quote, "Put them into a frying pan with a small piece of butter." Perhaps half following another recipe, I decided to melt the butter first. It was barely a decision. I added the sausages. It was a low-medium heat, though Mrs. Beeton does not specify a heat. I set a timer for 12 minutes. Mrs. Beeton specifies 10 to 12 minutes. The music keeps interrupting my attention. Perhaps it is my return to things, flesh, the world. I can't stop dancing. Shaka Khan, I Feel For You comes on. And after a period of feeling out of my body, the winter, lockdown, fatigue, anxiety, like a surge of sap rising, I am electrified, full of desire and movement. Dancing, dancing, dancing. I am horny, exuberant, hot. I make coffee, hot sausages and hot coffee and hot toast. I grind some beans with a hand grinder, dancing all the while. I fill the kettle with water and press the switch. I turn the sausages, seeing that they have browned on the side that was in hot butter. As Mrs. Beeton instructs, I turn them a few more times, though I do not quite keep the pan moving as she instructs. It is my first time cooking the recipe. I am very excited. It is bringing me to life. I do not think I have noticed sausages bronzing, caramelising in this way before. I pour hot water over ground coffee. I tighten my apron to feel the strings tighter over my body as I dance, flying on some kind of libidinal high. I think of Winnicott's dry, sausageless account of following this recipe. I cannot have quite pricked the sausages enough with a knife. Several have split slightly. One is coming, perversely, out of its casing at one end. They did not explode, though, as they might have had I not pricked them. I thought of his account of cooking sausages without a recipe, as if for the first time. But he could only cook the sausages at all because other recipes were floating in the air, because an imagination of a recipe is present. When I cook this recipe, it is as if I approach sausages for the first time. I find my fat sausages need more time than Mrs. Beeton allows. There are parts that remain pink even after 12 minutes have elapsed, and I had turned them as she said. I begin to feel concern about dryness or over and under cooking. While I finish them, I cook the toast and butter it and put it on the plates in the oven. Mrs. Beeton does not mention butter, but not using it seems too dry. Finally, I put 2 sausages on each plate and 2 more in the pan for seconds on toast. On the table are French and English mustards, ketchup and brown sauce. I only use the mustards. The sausages are exquisitely juicy. I love it. After we have eaten, The Cure, Pictures of You is on the radio. While I write up, I am sending messages to D and A, and among other things we discuss the dramatic imprecision of predicting when a baby will be born. One of them, A, was due over a week ago. It's just amazing how imprecise it actually is in terms of estimated due date, and how very different each mother-baby pair is, she says. Over lunch I say that I like that Mrs. Beeton gives an average cost and a season for sausages, and a note about hot weather, and a historical footnote about Saxon swineherds. That's the end. Anyway. And Winnicott has this fantasy of the not being a recipe, but there's a recipe for cooking sausages in the Odyssey, which is a 3,000-year-old text. So he has this fantasy of being not being dependent on the labour of others who come before him, which is you can't have it. There's thousands of cooks for 3,000 years who've been cooking sausages, and this fantasy of sovereignty, I think, the denial of the labour, especially gendered labour by women. Sorry, that was quite a long reading.
I've got one more question, and then maybe we can open it up to the.
And I'll keep it brief in my response.
Yes. Okay. All right. Throughout the book, there is you've already talked about this idea of self and other, and throughout the book there are these others, and there's also a you who you refer to as a you, and you cook for that you.
Yeah.
I'm not interested to know who that you is. I don't care. Well, it seems like a salacious question, and it's not important. But there is a kind of shift that takes place, which is very marked, and it coincides with the point at which the book, as you say, gets looser.
Yeah. Where
the concern for cooking for another, or the you, sort of shifts and turns back to you.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you could comment on that. Are these different yous?
Yeah.
Because also this is bound up with your seeing somebody else, but also being seen by somebody else as well. There's kind of a complicated relationship between cooking for other people and expressions of love, and that love turns back on you at some point.
I was fortunate to be on Anne Boyer's tiny letter or Substack, I can't recall which. She sent one which had a great passage in it about a you, which could be any other, someone you love or someone you've just met.
Yeah.
And I use the you as a sort of floating signifier for anyone who's not me throughout the whole book, because I wanted there to be a real kind of horizontal quality to other people and to the relationships, and I wanted the sort of intimacy of all those relationships to be sort of present. But I also realised that I was using cooking as a way to avoid intimacy. I was sort of, instead of being present myself, to an extent I was sending the dish that I cooked rather than have that proximity. I use, to go back to the Odyssey, well, not really the Odyssey, but anyway, there's a version of the story of Troy in which Helen doesn't go to Troy. She sends a phantom version of herself, which in Greek is called an eidolon. And so the Trojan Wars are fought on the basis of a ghost being sent to Troy. Anyway, I found that a useful way of thinking about, like, sometimes I don't send myself to have that intimacy. I send the dish to be my point of encounter with other, or to avoid an encounter actually with other people. So I wanted people to be close to me, so I use cooking to bring them close to me, but I also use cooking to avoid closeness at the same time. And then I sort of realised that about myself, at the end of the book. I figured stuff out in real time. I didn't know all the answers when I started, and that actually also made it exciting for me to write it. And have I answered your question? I don't know.
There's a point which is very striking where
where I shift.
You shift and you.
Yeah, and then I just realised that I was actually I was avoiding being vulnerable in the book myself, and that for some extent, and that's not to say it's sort of overtly confessional in a sort of voyeuristic way, but I realised that there were certain aspects of life to do with the questions I'm answering in the book that I was avoiding answering by not being so present myself. So I had to get some skin in the game, had to not be an Odysseus. I had to allow myself to collapse, allow myself to be present, to engage with those questions. And
you finish on Simone Weil, and the kind of tragic circumstances really of Vi nourishing others but not nourishing herself.
Yeah, she wanted to nourish the collective towards revolution, but she herself didn't eat enough to survive, and she died. And so, to nourish the collective, you also have to nourish yourself, and also acknowledge your position within the collective, and that you have a position and that it is embodied. And I think yeah, and I found that also there's an artwork by an artist called Raju Rage, who curated an exhibition I went to in Birmingham about recipes, and there's a film that they made called Eat While You Feed ? And it was about there's a woman in it, and she'd been kind of brought up to think about just cooking for her in-laws and serving them, and then there's a certain point when she realised that she needed to feed herself, so she withdrew some portion of her labour to the other to also look after herself, and she ate to eat whilst you feed. So I found that useful, and that it's okay, and also that I still existed if I wasn't cooking. And I sort of, when people came to visit me or see me, I sort of cooked rather than be present. And then one friend said, I don't give a shit, your food's nice and everything, but let's just hang out and let's just get some chips. And I was like, actually made me cry, because I found that really hard to accept. Yeah. Anyway, now I'm almost crying, sorry. Move on, let's open the questions.
Yes.
If you might also be exhausted now and not have a question, that's fine. Thanks everyone, thanks. Yeah. Get some chips. Yeah. Oh, hi Henry.
I have a quick question,
Yeah.
sorry. And this is about sausages.
Yeah, great.
So I'm thinking, right, the sausage is a recipe in itself. It is an amalgamation of all sorts of ingredients.
Yeah.
And Winnicott, if I've understood this correctly, is just taking someone else's recipe and just heating it up.
Wait,
So I'm
is
trying to work
is
out,
cooking a sausage
that's
as
what
heating
I'm
it up?
asking.
That you could underpin, you could deconstruct the whole basis of all cooking on that.
Well, no, because if you take raw ingredients
Yes.
and you put them together,
Yeah.
you are talking recipe. And you are talking
Wow.
cooking.
I
If
think
you
you've
are-
just got a different interpretation of what a recipe is to me. But that's fine.
Possibly.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm just intrigued by,
Yeah.
if you like, the creativity behind the sausage.
Yes.
Now, is it in the ingredients, i.e. the sausage maker?
Yes.
Are they the real creatives here? Those people in various factories or in
Yes.
various, back rooms or whatever,
Yeah.
getting the proportion of, say, the belly pork,
Yeah.
with the pork, with the salt, the sage, the pepper, etc.
Yeah.
Or is it the person who then takes their finely crafted recipe and puts it in a pan?
I think it's they're both of them are cooking and doing recipe. And I mean, in my sort of unhinged diagram, I have the abattoir, the pig, the sausage maker, the butcher, because I just suddenly realised that I was entering this mad network of relationships and of other people's labour and thoughts. And I suppose it's not a binary. It's not an either or a real cook or a non-real cook. Everyone's work is part of that moment, and you encounter all that labour in the moment of cooking the sausages. And hell, there's a lot of ways to cook a sausage, I think. Yeah.
Because some come already cooked.
Some come already cooked. You can put them in another dish. You can make a pasta sauce with a sausage. You can. I mean, I also think people intervene with their own ways of eating things, don't they? Like even like what sauce you're going to have as an intervention into that,
And for instance, should chicken sausages exist? And
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
If people want them, yeah. Yeah. Well, that's the great thing about food. It's a democratic field for discussion, and it's very hard to arrive at one objective point of view, and that's part of the fun of it. Everyone's got their own relationship with sausages. Yeah. Thanks, Henry. Oh, here's a question.
It's not so much a question about the book.
Yeah.
I was fascinated by your time at the BSR,
Okay.
where I've also been.
Oh, right.
And to project my own experiences onto you, a very strange place where you're cooked for
Mm.
when you're in an alien kitchen.
Yes.
And I wondered how you felt about that experience of almost having cooking taken away from you, and you've got this kind of set menu that's presented before you all the time, and I wondered whether you could talk about that.
Yeah. So the BSR, for those who don't know, it's called the British School at Rome, and I did a residency last year for a month, and they have a canteen, and they publish a menu every week, and it's much more austere than the American Academy in Rome, which I also went to. I blagged a free dinner there. At first I found it very great,
Okay.
because I was trying to edit the book, and it took away the responsibility for that domestic work from me, and according to my therapist, I had a regression that was helpful because I became more like a baby. But actually, at the end, I began to feel sort of strange that I hadn't been in a grocery shop.
Yeah.
And so I only did it for a month. Some people do it for 6 months. And you know, I had a big argument with my partner about the problematic quality of residencies and your sort of non-participation in labour in making those spaces. And actually, I won't go into it now in huge detail, but there were sort of various revolutionary discussions had about the system of the BSR when I was there. And then I did cook it, and I don't know if you read the book yet, but I did cook something and had a very intense moment. So there's a residence kitchen with a terrible cooker in it with a diagram that points to the wrong, that links up the knobs with the incorrect hob. So I spent 40 minutes trying to boil a pan of water, which I wrote about actually in a great indie journal called Bricks from the Kiln, if any of you like that. What am I saying? It's a really good journal with lots of really good writing and by people I really like. And I cite it anyway. Sorry, I cite other people from it in the book. So one, it was great, and actually lots of people talked about their working practices in the lunch times. And then I began thinking a lot about industrial canteens and the role of lunch hour as a way to discuss working practices, and that'll be in my next book. But I annotated all the lunches in great detail. And I found that interesting. But yeah, I did feel this sudden need to cook, and I did cook a meal for myself, and I write about it in the book. But yeah, I think you're right. It is a really interesting, it's an interesting thing to have all that labour taken away from you in those decisions, which can be useful because you know it is work, and you suddenly realise when you're not doing it how much work it fucking is. But also, I felt a bit alienated from myself, and I needed to do it again. Yeah, but after this, maybe I'll chat to you about your experience. Yeah. Thank you. Thanks.
No other questions? Okay.
I think that's great. Yeah. And anyone you want to come and chat afterwards?
Yeah. Okay. Well, just before we finish, I've been to Norwich's premier locally sourced organic butchers, and I've purchased a skewered sausage.
Oh my god!
Wait. Can we get a picture of that? No, the hand over there. The hand over, yeah?
Oh my god.
Hold on 1 second there. Thank you very much. Very good. Excellent, thank you.
Oh my god, I'm really
Going right
excited.
there,
Round of applause.